Okay, this video will show you the direct and indirect pathway using the blank template of the basal ganglia. So this is the template, and the color-coded areas are the basal ganglia. So let's label each. So we have stratum, which is composed of chordate nucleus. So this is our chordate nucleus. Putamen, Globus pallidus, internal and external, so this one is external, that's internal, and we have thalamus, which is not part of the basal ganglia but relay center to connect the outputs of the basal ganglia to the motor cortex. So this is VL thalamus, and we have subthalamus right below the thalamus, and this is the substantia nigra. Okay, so let's start with direct pathway. Direct pathway, let's start from the motor cortex, and you have to remember all the basal ganglia pathways. It starts from the cortex, forms a loop. So there's a neuron in the cortex that goes to the stratum first, and let's just use the putamen for our stratal neuron. So that's the first step, and the next step is the stratal neuron will project to the outputs of the basal ganglia, which is the globus pallidus internal, and the globus pallidus internal neuron will go to the VL thalamus, and from there it will go back to the motor cortex, so it forms a loop. And then the next step will be labeling which neurons are excitatory and which neurons are inhibitory. So in this direct pathway, the basal ganglia, the neurons in the basal ganglia are mostly inhibitory, so we can label this globus pallidus neuron as inhibitory. Also the stratal neuron is inhibitory, and the rest is excitatory. So the outputs from the thalamus is excitatory, and also the cortex to the putamen is excitatory. Now, let's look at what happens if we increase the activity of the motor cortex. So increase the input activity of the motor cortex. So we can use the label, the arrow, upward arrow indicates excitatory or increase in neurotransmitters, and downward arrow means the other way around. So let's start from the motor cortex. So if we increase this excitatory neurons from the motor cortex, you can imagine what will happen at the synapse in the putamen. More release of the neurotransmitters. So you can label this release of the neurotransmitters will be increased. And because this neurotransmitter is excitatory, what will happen to the next neuron? Yes, the activity of the next neuron will increase as a result. So you can put the upward arrow for the soma of this putamen neuron. What will happen to the synapse? It will release lots of neurotransmitters, so you can imagine the neurotransmitters being released a lot. You can indicate an upward arrow, but what happens to the next neuron? Because this neurotransmitters are inhibitory, the next neuron will be depressed, so you can now put the downward arrow in the soma of the globus pallidus internal. If the activity of this neuron are depressed, it will fire less action potential, and as a result it will release less neurotransmitter. And remember, this is inhibitory neuron, which means less inhibitory neurotransmitters are released, so it's less inhibitory neurotransmitters. And what happens to the next neuron? Because it's an inhibitory neurotransmitters, it's relatively excited. So it's again the opposite arrow for the synapse between the inhibitory neuron to the next neuron. So this will be increased, which means you will have more neurotransmitters released between the sinus, between this neuron, the thalamic neuron, and the cortical neuron. And as a result, because it's an excitatory neuron, it will be more excited. And this arrow indicates that the direct pathway is a positive feedback loop. There's one more aspect to this diagram, which is the influence of the substantia nigra to the stratum. So we need to draw one more neuron, which starts from the substantia nigra, which goes to the stratal neuron for synapse. And if you zoom that in, you can imagine at the synapse, it will release the neurotransmitter called dopamine. So this is our dopamine. And this is will be received by this stratal neuron through the D1 receptor. So the soma, you can imagine the soma of this stratal neuron in the direct pathway contains D1 receptor. And as a result of this opening of the D1 receptor, it will be depolarized, which means D1 receptor, whenever it receives the dopamine, it will activate the neuron, stratal neuron. And if you activate the stratal neuron, so this is same as this arrow, the end results will be the same as the circuit. So it will create the excitatory or positive feedback for the motor cortex. So you can write somewhere that dopamine, the function of the dopamine is to activate motor cortex for the direct pathway. So it activates motor cortex. Okay, let's save this. So this is our direct pathway. And open another one, the blank one. And let's do the indirect pathway. So I won't label this structure because it's been already labeled in the previous diagram. So this is the indirect pathway. And the difference between direct and indirect pathway is the involvement of the hypothalamus. So what happens is the rest are the same, it forms a loop, but let me just draw this. So the first input is the same, motor cortex goes to the stratum. And instead of going directly to the output, it goes to the Globus Pallidus external. And from Globus Pallidus external, you can't really see the soma because this color is the same, but it goes to the subthalamus. And from subthalamus, it goes to the output of the basal ganglia. And then output happens to the VL thalamus. And from VL thalamus goes back to the cortex. So it is a loop, but involves the subthalamus in between, in the circuit. And next step is to label which one is positive or excitatory and which one is inhibitory. So this is the same, it's excitatory, and the one in the basal ganglia is mostly inhibitory, so stratal neuron is inhibitory. Also the output of the Globus pallidus internal to VL thalamus is inhibitory. And also the Globus pallidus external to subthalamus is inhibitory. But subthalamic neuron has excitatory input to the Globus pallidus internal. So maybe this might be a bit tricky. You may have to remember that subthalamic output is excitatory, and that's the only excitatory neuron you can find within the basal ganglia circuitry. Now you're ready to see the direction of the arrows. So let's see what happens if we increase the activity of the motor cortex. So you can zoom that in and see the synapse here. Release of the neurotransmitters, and this is excitatory neurotransmitter, which means the neuron of the stratum neuron in the indirect pathway will be activated. Okay, next one is the sinus between the stratum neuron and the globus pallidus external, and you can also imagine there's neurotransmitter released a lot, so you can put this arrow, upward arrow, but for the globus pallidus external neuron, because these neurotransmitters are inhibitory, this will have decreased activity as a result, because more inhibitory neurotransmitters are released, so this neuron gets depressed. And let's move on. So if the neurons are depressed, the result will be less neurotransmitters. But because this is the inhibitory neuron, this will be inhibitory neurotransmitter, which means it will be relatively uninhibited. So this neuron will be excited as a result. So you can put the arrow here as a down. Neurotransmitters will be released less, and the result is opposite. The next neuron will get excited. And this is the excitatory neuron, so you can imagine this neurotransmitters are all excitatory, so it's released a lot, which means the activity of this neuron will be increased as a result. And let's follow that. If you increase the activity of the inhibitory neuron, the synapse, in the synapse, the neurotransmitters will release a lot, and because this is our inhibitory neuron, this neuron will get depressed. So you can put downward arrow here, and if you find the synapse now, because it gets depressed, less neurotransmitters will be released, which means whenever this is activated, the indirect pathway will depress or inhibit the motor cortex. And this arrow is the characteristics of the indirect pathway, and it's forming a negative feedback loop. And the last neuron will be the same, the substantia nigra to the stratal neuron. So let's draw that synapse. And again, the substantia nigra will release the dopamine onto the stratal neuron. So this is our dopamine. There's a difference in this action of dopamine, because the receptor in the stratal neuron in the indirect pathway, so you have to differentiate stratal neuron for direct pathway and indirect pathway. The soma has D2 receptors, and whenever the D2 receptors receive the dopamine, what happens is it hyperpolarizes the soma, which means it inhibits the soma. So the active dopamine is actually the opposite of this arrow. So opposite of this arrow. Instead of exciting this neuron, it will depress the neuron. And you don't really have to do all the sequences to find out what happens in the dopamine. You just reverse all the arrow, and end results will be reversing the end product of this arrow. So it will be reversing, so it will actually excite the motor cortex. So this is the effect of dopamine. On the indirect pathway. Which means exactly the same as the pathway, although it uses different pathways. The end results are the same. The dopamine excites the motor cortex. Okay, so let's zoom that out, and that was the indirect pathway.